You remember Din Bin Phu? No. The same thing happened in Algeria, in Africa. They didn't have anything but a rifle. The French had all these highly mechanized instruments of warfare, but they put some guerrilla action on.
Hello and welcome to Guerrilla History, the podcast that acts as a reconnaissance report of global proletarian history and aims to use the lessons of history to analyze the present. I'm your host, Henry Hakamaki, joined by my co-hosts, as always, Professor Adnan Husain, historian and director of the School of Religion at Queen's University in Ontario, Canada. Hello, Adnan. How are you doing today?
I'm well, Henry. Great to be with you.
It's always nice to see you. And I'm also joined by Breht O'Shea, host of Revolutionary Left Radio and co-host of the Red Menace podcast. Hello, Breht. How are you on this fine early morning recording?
Hello. Yeah, I'm doing great. Excited for this conversation.
Yeah, it's going to be a great one and very timely as well. So our guest today is going to be Carlos Sardiña Galache, who's the author of The Burmese Labyrinth, A History of the Rohingya Tragedy, out from Verso. Highly recommend everybody picking it up. Now, of course, this is timely because of recent events in Myanmar, where there has been a military coup and protesters are being killed by the dozens or even the hundreds now. We're recording this on March 29th. Last Wednesday, 114 protesters were killed in one day alone in Myanmar by the military coup government. And so understanding the past, understanding the history of Burma is very important to understanding the dynamics that are at play right now. And only by understanding the history are we really able to get a full picture of what's going on now, which is why I'm recommending to everyone to buy The Burmese Labyrinth and read it, because I know I speak for myself when I say before I read the book, my understanding of Burma/Myanmar's history was limited to, well, at one point they were colonized by the British, and then they were a military dictatorship, and Aung San Suu Kyi won the Nobel Peace Prize, and then they had their problems with the ethnic cleansing against the Rohingya. And I knew some of the details about the ethnic cleansing and whatnot. I mean, I was doing my undergrad at the time, so I was relatively involved in activism and whatnot surrounding that issue, but I didn't understand the deeper context of the country and of that crisis. So this book really did highlight a lot of it for me. I don't know, guys, what did you think of the book? And, did it help you understand the current context of events more? Adnan, I'll start with you and then we'll go to Breht.
Well, I did not know, I'm sorry to say, that much about Burmese history. Of course, I'd heard about the Rohingya crisis and the ethnic cleansing of them. But this really helped a lot. I thought this was an excellent survey, not only of contemporary events and the setting, but then it went, and it was organized in an interesting way. First, it presented the situation around the Rohingya, what had happened fairly recently in this last decade, to set up the key sorts of points and questions, but then used history by going back to the pre-colonial and colonial era to help explain why ethnicity, why religion were functioning in a particular way in the national identity, or lack thereof in some ways, you could say, of this country. And so it really helped make things much more sensible. But what I would say about the most recent events is that it's not completely clear exactly how the military coup fits into this story of ethnicity and religion in some ways, in terms of the national identity. That seems to be a more abiding kind of problem of modern history in this region. I wouldn't say that there's necessarily, I think you'll understand a lot about this country, which you will need to do, because I think events will continue to unfold. But I found this a very well-written story. It really covered the transformations of colonialism, what colonialism actually does and how it reorients the previous conditions of a society that has had lasting significance in the post-colonial era. And so it reminded me so much of the stories and histories of other fragmented post-colonial nations that are left in a really precarious situation that are ripe for ethno-national conflict in places like Africa, other parts of the British Empire, like Eastern Africa, in Kenya, Uganda, where the British moved a lot of populations as part of their colonial endeavors, and then that ended up leaving long-lasting problems for, say, the East Indians of East Africa. And so there was a kind of similar sort of problem here. But I was also quite amazed at how fragmented the country was, with so many post-colonial national kind of independence resistance movements that you never hear talked about in the media. And it really suggested the fragility of this national identity, which perhaps explains some of the instability and the military sort of coups, because a coherent national culture never seems to have been forged as a result of the way colonialism reshaped the importance of ethnic identities into political identities.
Yeah, I think that was a very good summary. Breht, why don't we get your thoughts on this work and how it relates to the current events, and then we'll wrap back to talking a little bit about the history after that. But I want to focus first on how this relates to current events within Myanmar.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. In order to understand the present, you must understand history, and that's no less true here than it is anywhere else. I particularly want to echo Adnan's point about colonialism's history with regards to conflicts between ethnic groups, and so much of the dysfunction happening in global South countries all over is a function of this previous cutting up of territories to serve colonial interests, and simultaneously creating, often consciously, creating situations inside countries that inherently made them unstable in order to benefit colonialism going forward. This also happened in the Middle East as well, where their French and British empires, cut up certain countries like Syria or Lebanon, specifically so that they would be so infighty that they would be weakened and unable to unite against colonialism writ large. And so just that tension and that historical trajectory of colonialism feeding into, either consciously or not, ethnic identities and conflicts, and then playing on them going forward for its own benefits. And then when they want to walk away, they just sort of pat their hands, walk away from the situation, and then blame it on the people as if they had no role to play, or it speaks to some dysfunction in that culture or whatever. But again, I think this is, all of us come from the same point of view of not understanding the history very well of this this country. And I think that's going to be true for 99% of our listeners. But the two things that you've probably heard of, if you're listening to this show and don't know anything about Myanmar, Burma, and the history, is the genocide of the Rohingya and of the recent coup. And so those are two little flashpoints that I think most people will be at least vaguely familiar with, that are doorways into understanding this broader history. And the name says it all, the Burmese labyrinth. It's gesturing at the utter complexities of the ethnic conflicts, the religious conflicts, the history, and the ongoing crises. It is an incredibly and particularly complex situation.
And I want to just dwell for a second on the depravity of the Rohingya crisis. This is a crisis that's been going on for decades. I know we were really focused on it 4 years ago or so, but this has been something that's been going on for decades. In 1978, there was an operation that forced 200,000 Rohingya out of the country and into Bangladesh as refugees. Between 2012 and 2015, another 100,000 were forced to Bangladesh as refugees. And then, of course, in 2017, during the big, again, ethnic cleansing genocide, call it what you want, I think both terms are quite apt in this case, 700,000 Rohingya were forced out of the country as refugees or killed. Between those three, you're looking at 1 million Rohingya that left. That's well over 90% of the Rohingya that were in Myanmar at any given time are now outside of the country living as refugees, and those that are still inside of Myanmar are living as internally displaced peoples in in camps that the conditions are absolutely atrocious. And in Carlos's book, he outlines just how bad the conditions are in these camps for these internally displaced persons, as well as in the refugee camps in Bangladesh for the people who did flee the country. And the conditions are absolutely shocking. This is the entire population of this ethnic group that has been in Myanmar, despite what many in the country want to believe, for a very, very long time. These are not invaders from outside. These are people that lived in Myanmar for decades or centuries. And I'm sure that we'll talk about this in the conversation, but the depravity of the situation really is shocking. And this is something that I did know going into reading this book. I did know about the Rohingya tragedy, but yet I didn't know just how depraved it was until reading this book and being able to connect the historical context with the current context of what was happening to these individuals. So this book really was critical for me in being able to piece those two things together and really get a deeper understanding of this crisis. I don't know if either of you want to say anything about the Rohingya tragedy, or else we can just talk about, maybe a little bit of the things that we're looking forward to picking through in the history of the book. I guess, Adnan, I'll start with you. Take up however you want, whether you want to comment on the Rohingya tragedy or some things that you're looking to get out of the historical context in our conversation with Carlos. Oh, and just before I turn it over to you, in regards to the recent events, the Coup events, I'm just going to direct the listeners to 2 interviews that I've already done with Carlos, perhaps 3 by the time this episode comes out, on the recent post-Coup events. I conducted those on the David Feldman Show, and I'll include the links to those in the description of this episode so that you can easily find those and listen to those for the current context, basically the breaking news. But what we're going to be doing here in this episode is looking at the history of the country and the Rohingya tragedy. That way we are able to understand the current events better. Adnan?
Well, I did want to echo that, I did know to some extent about the scale and extent of the refugee crisis and the ethnic cleansing tragedy, but this book really does document and vividly portray, as you were saying, Henry, the really gruesome and heartrending details of the human crisis. And when we think of them just as statistical questions or problems and enumerate the numbers, the impact, is great, but it doesn't hit home at the level of genuine sort of human empathy with the actual lived experience people are suffering and undergoing. And this book definitely captures that in a very humane and empathetic way. And so that is definitely something that probably listeners have not necessarily really grappled with or grasped. So it's a good reason to pick up this excellent, very well-written book, very comprehensive and sober analysis, while at the same time conveying these really important and powerful experiences of suffering and oppression. In terms of what I would like to think about and talk about a little bit more is really understanding the intersections between how ethnic identities were formed. We tend to think of them as long-lasting and, existing in time immemorial in the same way and shape. And what history, really studying history, allows us to understand is that they might have different dimensions or take on new meanings. And so this is something that in the colonial era, these ethnic identities came to mean different things as a result of British colonial policy. And so I'll be interested to talk a little bit further in elucidating how fluid and capacious senses of self and other come to be hardened and politicized, and how and why that happens, because that seems to be when you have these tragic ethnic conflicts, is when new ideas about ethnic identity seem to emerge that we think existed for all time, but actually these political problems are products of of history. So that'll be very useful to excavate that. And I guess the other thing that's interesting is just to try and understand how the contradictions of national identity worked specifically to exclude the Rohingya from being able to have a stable place, and why and how that is. I think we're living in a period where there's an awful lot of fear about migrant populations. We're living through an era of a great global refugee crisis. And even in our own country, the discourses the discourses about the dangers and threats of foreigners and of immigrants and of being illegal immigrants is a powerful political discourse that's used to exclude and aggrandize certain kinds of interests. And so it's interesting to see how important that was to this story as well, and thinking about how this is a global phenomenon that we're witnessing and dealing with about immigration and migration. And on the left, I think we really have to think very carefully about how we can have human solidarity beyond the way in which nation states are restricting and excluding people to think about, humane values globally.
Breht, I'm going to turn to you for the final thoughts on anything that you want to say, but I'll have you basically lay on the table any other final thoughts, as well as what you're hoping to get out of this conversation, maybe that you want to clarify from the book during the conversation that we're going to have with Carlos, and then we'll get right into the interview for the listeners.
Sure. Well, first, just to echo what Adnan said, I think that's an incredibly important point and deserves to be emphasized. I guess the only thing that I would add on top of that is just the deep personal interest I have given my engagement with Buddhism. And, it's very interesting because, in the West, we sort of understand religious conflict, certainly in the Abrahamic traditions, Jewish people versus Muslims versus Christians, that all makes complete sense. And then with like Modi in India, we definitely understand what Hindu nationalism can look like, right? So then when people in the West, often people with only a vague understanding of Buddhism, hear about something like Buddhist ultranationalism or a genocide being led by Buddhists, it strikes the person as inherently sort of odd in a way that other religious conflict might not seem odd. But I think that's a reminder that the ideologies and the religious impulses are situated historically, socially, and politically. And every religion has a political spectrum in it. Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism have a left, center, and a right. And those can move and shift depending on the socio-political and economic climates in which they're operating. Another interesting connection is Burma's history specifically with Buddhism is incredibly crucial to Buddhism being introduced to the United States. In the 60s, like the big people that brought over Theravada Buddhist traditions, which we now call Vipassana, or even more pop culturally mindfulness, right, comes in large part from a few people in the 60s, Joseph Goldstein, Jack Kornfield, Sharon Salzberg, who went over to Southeast Asia, but specifically Burma, did long meditation retreats, learned Buddhism from Burmese teachers, and then brought them back. So the IMS, the Insight Meditation Society, and the whole mindfulness sort of craze in the U.S. has direct links to the very history that we're going to be discussing in this episode. So I would like to explore that as much as time allows, because I don't want to get too far afield. I want to explore some of that in the upcoming conversation.
Well, on that note, and by the way, Breht, that was a very profound statement, and I want to thank you for bringing that up. I really do think that's quite important in this story. But let's turn over to the conversation with Carlos now. We'll bring him in. So listeners will be right back with that interview with Carlos Sardiña Galache, author of The Burmese Labyrinth, A History of the Rohingya Tragedy. And we're back on Guerrilla History. Now we've gotten through the introduction of talking about the history of Burma and what we're looking forward to in this conversation. And now we're joined by the author of The Burmese Labyrinth, A History of the Rohingya Tragedy, Carlos Sardiña Galache. Hello, Carlos. How are you doing today?
Hi. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. And I've interviewed you twice before on the David Feldman Show talking about recent events in Myanmar. And I really enjoyed both of those conversations. And I think that it's a very important topic, given that we're not really given a lot of extensive coverage on what's happening in Myanmar here in the West. But as we were saying in the introduction segment, to really understand what's happening now, it's very important to understand the historical context of the country. And your book does a very, very good job of that. But assuming that a lot of the listeners haven't read your book yet, and listeners, I would definitely recommend going out and picking up the Burmese Labyrinth. Why don't I turn this over to you right now, Carlos, and allow you to lay down the groundwork of the history of Burma. So maybe take us all the way from pre-colonization by the British all the way up to the present, just in broad terms, and then we'll dive in a little bit deeper with questions after that.
Yeah, basically you want me to sum up the second part of the book.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a very good section of your book. But yeah, let's hear your elevator pitch for it.
Okay. I think the first thing we have to understand about Burma is that Burma, prior to the colonial invasion by the British, didn't exist as such. Didn't exist in the shape that we know today. And even the ethnic groups that now form part of Burma weren't exactly there in the same shape that they are now. Before the British arrived, central Burma was a collection of very unstable kingdoms that dominated by what we now call the Bamar majority or Burman majority. And then in the outlying areas of the country, we had different stateless, such as the Rakhine, which was a kingdom on its own, and different communities like the ancestors of the Kachin, the Karen, the Shan, the Chin, and so on and so forth. The different ethnic groups that are now regarded as national races in Burma. Now that changed when the British arrived. The British basically conquered Burma in three stages, in three different wars. One in 1824, the second one in 1853, and the third one in 1884. And basically what they did was to unify Burma as a political entity for the territory that is now known as Burma for the first time in history. But they did it in a very particular way because at that time the British were doing two kinds of government, what they call direct government and indirect government. So in the outlying areas of Burma, I'm thinking here of Kachin, of what is now Kachin State, Shan State, Karen State, not Rakhine. Arakan was part of Central Burma. That was indirect rule. That is, the British rule through local elites from the ethnic groups living in those places. Whereas in Central Burma, they had direct rule. So at the same time, you can say that the British had a centripetal effect on Burma in the sense that they unified Burma, but at the same time, they had a centrifugal effect in the sense that they separated very hardly the different groups in Burma through this difference between direct rule and indirect rule. And they also did another thing, which is that they solidified the ethnic identities that were already kind of present in Burma, but were not so watertight. Let's say, and there is a good example of this in Edmund Leach, the anthropologist Edmund Leach research. For instance, regarding the Shan and the Kachin. Basically, you had a different social systems, and depending on what social system you adopted or what polity you migrated to, you would be Shan or Kachin, and you would change your ethnicity, maybe even in your own life, or at least in a couple of generations or one generation. But that was stopped by the British, who basically through the modern state technologies, especially censuses, put everybody in very tight ethnic boxes. So that explains a lot the ethnic conflicts that have plagued Burma ever since independence. Because not everybody was fighting for independence in the same way. And the British also put some groups against each other, like, for instance, recruiting soldiers from what they call the martial races from the Atlantis, meaning especially the Kachin, the Karen, and the Chin. So that created a lot of resentment with the Bamar majority, who were not recruited at all. I mean, there were some Bamar soldiers, but very, 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 very few. And at the same time, the British did another thing, that they included Burma as a province of the Indian Empire, and that meant that Indian people could migrate to Burma quite freely, and that created a lot of resentment too, because the British had been longer in India. They had more lawyers in India, for instance. They had more administration staff. And they imported a lot of administrative staff for the colonial state apparatus from India to Burma, which created a lot of resentment among the local population, especially the Bamar, towards the Indian immigrants. And the consequences of this are seen up to these days. Then, in the first decades of the 20th century, emerged a nationalist movement, which was mostly Bamar, was mostly by the majority, and was mostly separated from other kind of nationalist movements, like the Kachin, the Rakhine, the Chin, the Karen, and so on. So there was not a single unified nationalist movement which included all the ethnic groups. Albeit, supposedly the idea of the Bamar was to create some kind of all-inclusive nation. But there was always this element of Bamar supremacism, which was very weak at the beginning, but grew stronger, especially after independence. Now, all these tensions between different ethnic groups came to a head in World War II, when different ethnic groups took different sides. So, for instance, the Bamar, led by the father of independent Burma, Aung San, who also happens to be the father of Aung San Suu Kyi, at first took the side of the Japanese. This is a long and complicated story why they did that, but basically they took the side of the Japanese in order to get rid of the British. But the Karen, the Kachin, and so on, they took the side of the British. In Rakhine, also happened the same. In Rakhine, the Rakhine people took the side of the Japanese, the Japanese invaders at the beginning of the war, but the British armed the Muslim population, the Rohingya. So what happened is that in World War II, there were clashes not only between Japan and Great Britain, but also between the Bamar army led by Aung San and the Karen guerrillas, and more specifically in Rakhine State, between the Rakhine majority, the Buddhist majority of Arakan, and the Muslim minority, the Rohingya. And that created a lot of resentment that basically survives to this day. So then eventually Burma was independent in 1948. Aung San was assassinated a few months before in 1947. And Aung San was probably a more conciliatory guy than many of the people that came, the many Bamar leaders that came after him. And he was a man with socialist leanings who was willing to accept the descendants of Indian immigrants as Burmese citizens and so on. But he was killed. And we had a few years of democratic movement, government, between 1948 and 1962. In 1962, Ne Win, one of the comrades of Aung San at the beginning, but also a political rival, who was at the time the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, took power in a coup d'etat, and basically he inaugurated 50 years of military dictatorship that took different shapes. What Ne Win did was to deepen the interethnic cleavages in Burma. He initiated also a series of racist policies against the Rohingya, who were recognized during the first years of independence. And basically, he created the notorious citizenship law in 1982. The citizenship law that would be used to strip the Rohingya of citizenship. And he basically initiated a project of Burmanization in which the central power of the government, of the Bamar majority, was imposed on the ethnic minorities, which is something that already had began during the democratic period, but it got much worse with Ne Win and successive military governments. So basically what the military did was to impose a very racist ideology in which only the so-called national races are to be regarded as bona fide citizens of Burma. These national races are defined as those who were in the Burmese territory before the First Anglo-Burmese War. Now, this is problematic for a variety of reasons, and one of them is, as we said before, is that Burma didn't exist as such back then. But also, many of the groups were not really kind of formed as political / ethnic entities. So basically, this notion of national races is reading backwards of identities that are very present now, but maybe were not as present during the pre-colonial period. So that's what Burma is. Burma, I define it at the end of the book, not as a country, but as a biocenosis, taking the word from a very nasty and right-wing Spanish philosopher, but we don't need to get into that, Gustavo Bueno. And basically, a biocenosis is like an ecosystem in which depends on certain equilibrium between different species, right? The original comparison was with Europe, and I think it's kind of adequate to Europe, in which there is this certain equilibrium between different species, but it's equilibrium based on the struggle of different species against each other. And that's the unity of Burma as a country, not as an imagined community of people who all live together in Benedict Anderson's words. It's just a country that has been always been at war precisely because of this imposed unity by the Bamar majority.
That's a wonderful sketch of the arc of history. I guess one question I wanted to ask you about that earlier period in some ways is to flesh out a little bit of the consequences of the colonial, how that changed these ideas and understandings of ethnicity. And that is just to clarify that in the pre-colonial period that you were mentioning, where there were multiple statelets contending with one another, how would you characterize, so people can understand, the way ethnicities worked in those polities? Because were they mixed polities where the dynasty may have a particular ethno-linguistic identity, but they would rule over and govern over a mixed society with different ethnic groups? And how does that go? How did that operate then? And what does colonialism do specifically besides the categorizing in censuses and things like that to really firm up and make rigid this kind of basis of ethnicity?
There were ethnic classifications before the British arrived in Burma.
Right.
The world was divided between different lumions. That's a Burmese word that basically means type of people. There were different lists, up to 100 groups and so on. But ethnicity was not a political category.
Right.
The kingdoms in central Burma, which were dominated by the Myanmar mostly, but at some times you might find a Shan king as the ruler of the kingdom, were not worried about ethnicity. They were worried about universal claims of rule, taken from Buddhist cosmology, basically, which means what they call a righteous leader. So as long as you were a righteous leader who funded the Sangha, the Buddhist community, and extended Buddhism as much as you could in the land, you were accepted as a ruler. They, of course, that was very much in theory, and the universal pretensions were not always realized in fact, of course. But that was the ideal of the central kingdoms. So people would adhere to different kings because they were seen as righteous rulers, not because they were seen as members of this or that group. So, for instance, you would have Mon, another ethnicity, fighting alongside a Bamar king against a Mon king.
Yes,
and vice versa, because ethnicity was not a political category at that time. And also, what you had in Burma, especially in central Burma, was a very, very big plain where it's very sparsely populated, where you, as a king, would want to get control over as many people as possible to, build your big construction projects to the glory of yourself and Buddhism and so on. So you couldn't be choosy about the ethnic groups that you would take under your rule. Now, when the British arrived, they, as I said before, they separated groups, but they not only classified them, they actively impose policies that, for instance, made very difficult to trade between one group and others. So, and they gave different roles to different people. Like they had all these racialist ideas, very much in vogue in the 19th century in Victorian Britain, right? In which you have martial races, but you have the Bamar who were regarded as somehow lazy, childish, and cunning, and not up to hard work, and so on. So they pretty much divided the population and made a division of labor and an economic division, which was made along these ethnic racial lines, And that contributed to solidify the ethnic groups that we are seeing today. And it must be said that it was also kind of something in which the groups themselves participated, because these groups started to realize that they lived in a modern world in which nation states categorized along ethnic lines were the rules of the game. So they started to make political demands in the name of ethnic groups. In a way, you can say that in Marxian terms, it's like I wouldn't bring this analogy too far, but you might say that it was somehow that the ethnic groups became changed from ethnic groups in themselves to ethnic groups for themselves. That is, conscious of their own potential, conscious of their own political power, and so on. So it was partly the British, of course, but also the ethnic groups started to speak the language of ethnicity, they speak the language of nations. And that was the rule of the game when the independence arrived, which had been, developing during the British period.
So I'm going to follow up here. And I think that this question is going to set up Breht well to talk about religion. But you write in your book that during the 1920s, monks were actually at the vanguard of the anti-colonial movements and actually laid the groundwork for a really nationalist movement. And you follow up by saying that these political actions by monks actually goes against the monastic laws, but the British had gotten rid of any sort of authority that could have policed that, which allowed for there to be monks that were really driving forward this political movement. Then you write about you could say the first martyr of Burmese nationalism, and I'm going to butcher the name, but Otama, something like that. Otama. Okay. Would you be able to talk about how the role of these monks and how the role of this martyred monk, Otama, really did foster a sense of nationalism within the country, and how that was important for the independence struggle that followed?
Well, as I said before, the legitimacy of the old kings, of the old rulers before colonial times, was based on the of being patrons of the Buddhist religion, of the monastic community, and also on building temples and building pagodas and so on. And also the Buddhist monks were very much in charge of education in pre-colonial Burma. What happened is that obviously the British couldn't claim this source of legitimacy because they were not Buddhist, for starters. So the Burmese Sangha, the Burmese Buddhist community, felt that the new rulers didn't have legitimacy, not only because they were foreigners and they were, they imposed their rule by force, which is something that anyway had happened before with every single kingdom, but because they were not patronizing the Sangha, the monastic community. Now, the British also were not very respectful of certain customs in Burma. And as I mentioned in the book, one of the first, we can say, proto-nationalist movements was against the British, because the British didn't take off their shoes whenever they entered a pagoda, something that is considered still extremely rude. It's extremely disrespectful to enter into a pagoda with your shoes on. And that was one of the first mass movements against British rule in the 20th century. Now, the monks had this idea that the monks fostered this idea that to be Burmese is to be Buddhist. And as most of the other religions in Burma had, actually most of other religions had arrived before, but in very small numbers before the British. But after the British, you had many more Muslims, you had many more Christians coming to the country and so on. So they started to develop this idea that religion and nation are inextricably joined. But this is actually much more complicated than that, because Uotama, who was Rakhine, by the way, Uotama was a guy who advocated for unity with Muslims against the colonial empire. Uotama was a guy who traveled to India, who at some point met Gandhi, who traveled to Japan. He was a cosmopolitan man. A little bit like all these people that, I don't know if you have read this book by Benedict Anderson, Under Three Flags, which talks about this, these networks of anti-colonial resistance against the Spanish Empire between Cuba and the Philippines, but also with other people from the British Empire and the French Empire. So you can say that Uotama was part of this loose network of international anti-colonial resistance. So he was advocating unity between different religions against the common enemy, the British. But that's something that is quite forgotten in historiography now. Uotama is just seen as one of the first nationalists. And what happened is that, as you say, the monks are not supposed to be involved in politics. They are not supposed to be involved in worldly matters. They are supposed to be involved only in their own spiritual betterment and the spiritual betterment of the community they serve. But the reason that they made was that under the conditions of British colonization, we cannot work well enough for the spiritual betterment of our community. So in order to work well for the spiritual betterment of our community, we need to get rid of the British first. And that's a political issue. It's regrettable. We have involved in political issues, but that's what we have to do. But that created, and I think in many cases, as in the case of Uotama unwittingly, that created this, union of religion and politics that has been so important in the subsequent history of Burma.
And that's incredibly interesting. And so much of this story does revolve around the interplay of different religions, specifically of Buddhism and its relationship to other religions. You've talked a little bit about the cosmology of Buddhism, about the idea that to be Burmese is to be Buddhist. I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about the ideology of Buddhism in Burma and how it relates to the ideology of nationalism, and then maybe talk a little bit more about the specificities of tensions between other religious groups like Christians, Muslims, etc.
Buddhism in Burma is Theravada Buddhism, which is usually more traditionalist than Buddhism, the other great branch of Buddhism. From Mahayana stems Zen Buddhism in Japan, or the kind of Buddhism that they practice in Tibet, like the Dalai Lama. To make a very there is an analogy between being Catholic and being Protestant, but we cannot take that analogy too far. So maybe it's better I don't go that way. But let's say that Theravada Buddhism is more based on ritual, on doing rituals right, whereas as a means for salvation, whereas Mahayana tends to be more about action, which doesn't mean that Theravada is not about action as well, about the acts that you commit. Now, Buddhism in Burma, as I said before, is a strong legitimizing force, a political force during pre-colonial times and even now. And it also means Buddhism also relates to the idea of karma and that also has political consequences. Because roughly, you can say that if you had karma, you will have a good situation. So if you are the king, if you are a rich guy, for instance, that means that you have good karma. So sometimes this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like if you are, for instance, in pre-colonial times, the guy with the highest karma and better karma and the best karma was the king. So if I go and I manage to dethrone him and take power myself, automatically everybody's going to say, oh yeah, actually he's the one with good karma. So and as there were no clear rules of succession, that's very often the way that kings were replaced. So in the eyes of the Buddhist community in Burma, to have a good Buddhist ruler is very important, because according to the Buddhist cosmology, the concept of Dhamma or Dharma, which you can translate as both as universal order but also as morality, is paramount. So there is this belief that if you are a righteous ruler, then the country at large, the nation at large, will go well. And that's a little bit of the idea with Aung San Suu Kyi. That Aung San Suu Kyi is seen as a righteous potential ruler now, not ruler anymore. She's seen as a righteous ruler. And if we have this very highly moral ruler, the country will go well. And she's even considered a bodhisattva. A bodhisattva is someone who could attain salvation, but chooses to stay on earth to spread Buddhism and spread the Dharma among the population. So this cosmology is very important. But what happens is that it clashes with other religions, because of course the Muslims or Christians are going to have completely different ideas. Now, what happened during colonial times is that many of these ethnic minorities were not Buddhists before, were animists, the Karen, the Kachin, the Tsin, and so on. And for the missionaries going to Burma, was much easier to convert to Christianity people from animism than it was from Buddhism. And basically, they converted most of the ethnic minorities. And that created another cleavage between ethnic communities, right? Because as Buddhism is so politically important, these other people who don't share our religion are somehow not from the same polity as us. And also this sense of having a different religion, Christianity, also foster a sense of identity in those groups, and that also contributed to the ethnic divisions that we see now.
So we've talked about the ethnic divisions. We've talked about the religious divisions and how those have kind of driven history. But I want to have you discuss class. Let's have a class analysis. After all, as Marx said, the history of all hereto existing societies is the history of class struggles. So there is a class component in here that was driving Burmese history that you briefly touched on. But I think it's important that we don't view this solely as ethnic divisions and racial divisions, and that we do take a look at that class analysis as well. So can you do that for the listeners?
Yeah, well, the thing is that class depended very often on ethnicity as well, right? Because, for instance, the money lenders in Burma, when the British arrived, were the Chettiars, who are an ethnic group for southern India. From southern India, from southern India. And that created this idea that different classes were different ethnic groups, which is not exactly the case. And You have also Bamar elites and other ethnicities elites, but it's kind of hidden, beneath these ethnic divisions. But during the British time, the British colonial period, it was very much the case that there was a roughly overlapping between class and ethnicity. Now, after independence, that changed quite a bit, and basically, the higher classes were Bamar, and many of them were, especially in the last 30 or 40 years, many of them were of Chinese heritage. But there is also an inter-ethnic class alliance between the elites of different ethnic groups. So, for instance, one of the things that the Burmese military government managed to do after 1988, when they got rid of this Burmese way of to socialism of Ne Win, was to co-opt the economic elites of the ethnic minorities, the Kachin, the Karen, and so on. Basically, because most of the ethnic resources, the natural resources are in the ethnic minority areas. So the central government, the military government, wanted to take all this, to take as much as of those natural resources as possible, and they did so in cooperation with the local elites, who usually were part of the ethnic minorities, majorities in those areas. So, for instance, in the 90s, after several decades of civil war between the ethnic armed groups and the Tatmadaw, the Central Army, there were a series of ceasefires, and kind of unofficial ceasefires, in which there was no political settlement at all, but there was a kind of economic settlement with the elites of these ethnic minorities. For instance, in Kachin State, you have the jade mines in Pakan, or you have the huge timber business, and usually is Bamar controlling the bulk of it, but some in the Kachin elite taking some a small piece of the pie. So in that way, for many years, the wars subsided a little bit. So there was also a kind of class struggle between the ethnic minorities themselves, or I wouldn't say class struggle, but I would say more discontent among for instance, the poorer Kachin, because they saw the elites during those ceasefires. They saw these elites as selling out to the Bamar government, but it didn't really go too far. But at the same time, there was an intra-class conflict in these minorities, because some businessmen from those minorities benefited from that, and some others not. So economy is also a very important factor. But the thing is that with these ethnic divisions, the government, the military regime has basically subdued any form of interworking class solidarity between different ethnic groups, and that hasn't existed. And there is an incipient alliance between different the working classes of different ethnic groups now as a protest against the most recent military coup.
Well, with all of that as the broad context, which is useful to help us explain, what some of the modern conflicts are, I wondered if we could come to talking a little bit now about what the sources of the Rohingya crisis in particular are, and how and why they did not fit into the way in which there was an ethnicization of politics and the way in which a kind of Burmese nationalism was constructed, such that they seem to have. There might have been certain eras where there was brief periods where it was a little bit better for them, but nonetheless, it seems at every stage in the modern history, since especially post-independence, they have been somehow left out of and been an excluded group. And I'm wondering if you could go into a little bit, who are they and why do they seem not to be able to fit into the narratives of Burmese nationhood in this modern period?
Yeah, well, the problem with the Rohingya is that their history doesn't fit very well with this conception of ethnic national races that we mentioned before, which is a very restrictive conception in which the borders of modern Burma are regarded as an eternal given that were already there and from time immemorial and so on, which is not absolutely the case. Mm-hmm. So the Rohingya are a group that straddles between two worlds, which would be the Burmese world and the Bengali world, the world of Bangladesh. So as the problem with the Rohingya is that when you divide Burma so strongly with the rest, and you read that backwards, as we mentioned before, as you get into really strange misconceptions. So, for instance, the Shan, and I don't want to go far away from the Rohingya, but for instance, the Shan are Thai. And they kind of consider themselves brothers of the Thai, mm-hmm. Right? And actually, it could have been perfectly the case that what is now Shan State would have been part of Thailand if history had gone differently. And the same with Rakhine. Rakhine is there was this anthropologist Edmund Leach, which I quoted before. And I quoted him again. He described Burma as a border area between China and India, and meaning that it took things from both, mm-hmm. Not as a completely separated entity, self-closed entity. And Rakhine, or Arakan, where the Rohingya live, is also a border area between the Burmese and the Bengali world. And throughout pre-colonial history, that didn't matter. Most kings were Buddhists, but they would adopt Muslim names. They would include the kalima, the profession of faith, in their coins, because they had a lot of Muslim subjects. And actually, the borders between Rakhine and the kingdoms in Bengal were quite fluid. Sometimes the Rakhine king would conquer up to Chittagong, and the Bengali kings would conquer up to what is now Sitwe. It was part of the same cultural world. Mm-hmm. Now, with this solidification of ethnic identities, with this solidification of nations as political constructs that came with the British, it solidified the idea that Rakhine was that the kingdom of Arakan was Buddhist, was Rakhine, was purely something else than Bengal. And also many Rohingya, many ancestors of the present day Rohingya migrated to Arakan during colonial times. But these were not people different from the Muslims that were already living there. And as we said, it was a continuous area, basically, Bengal and Arakan. But they made this division, this strong division that on one side of the Naf River is the Bengali world, on the other side is the Arakanese Burmese world. So then the Rohingya were straddling these two worlds. Actually, in the same way that the Rakhine were straddling the two worlds, but from the other side, from the Bamar side of the border of Arakan, right? So the Rohingya were regarded as somehow a different group when the British arrived, because they classified them differently. They never used the word Rohingya. The British apparently, in their censuses, they never used the word Rohingya. And there is a good reason for that, because Rohingya just means Arakanese.
Right. That's I was going to ask about that, because it seems like it's a designation in the Bengali sort of language of indicating people, especially Muslim people in Arakan, right?
Yes.
And Rakhine and Rohingya are actually very similar cognate words. It's like, Deutsch versus, Deutschland versus Germany, or something like that. Two different words coming really from the same idea.
Yeah. So the Rohingya didn't have any need to assert themselves as a different group, right? During colonial times, they were just living there. There was not a real border between Arakan state and Bengal, because everything was part of India anyway. So they didn't have any particular need to say we are Rohingya. But the name Rohingya appears very early on in Francis Buchanan, and a kind of explorer who visited Burma in the late 18th century. So the Rohingya were just there. They were Muslims in a multicultural, multi-religious kingdom called Arakan, dominated by Rakhine kings, the Buddhist kings, who most probably had as their ancestors both people from the central lands of Burma and from Bengal. I mean, everything was mixed, right? So it was only when these nationalist movements emerged that the Rohingya were started to be an issue. And it was only then that the Rohingya around the 50s started to assert an identity as a political force, a political instrument. Now, if you go to the Kachin, for instance, the name Kachin itself is an exonym. It's not how the Kachins call themselves. And the Kachin include very different groups. And only in the 20s, a Kachin identity as a nation, political movement, and so on, started to consolidate. Now, what happens with the Rohingya is that they arrive slightly later to this ethnic nationalist politics, right? So as they arrive a little bit later, let's say in the 50s or so, maybe in the 40s, Bamar and Rakhine nationalists said, "Oh, this is an invented name." Well, all names are invented, isn't it? I mean,
Carlos, I'm going to follow up here. So as we're talking about right now, kind of tangentially, but I really want to dig into this specific point. The wider society of Myanmar views the Rohingya as foreigners, as people not from the area. And I'm going to read out two quotes from your book, which are very incisive, and they're from interviews that you conducted with individuals, high up individuals in Myanmar. And listeners, this is my pitch for you to pick up the book, because this is some excellent journalism right here. So you were talking to the second most important person in the NLD, which is Aung San Suu Kyi's party, and you brought up the crisis in Arakan state, which is where the Rohingya have been traditionally. And he said, "The problem there is created by foreigners, the Bengalis. That is a problem we have had for a very long time. All the people in the country regard these people as foreigners. They are Bengalis who crossed to this country over land and by sea and by river. Then later on, you have another quote from the executive secretary of Arakan State. And again, you bring up the brutality that was occurring in the area. And he said, yes, exactly. And he says, we have to protect our national interests, and those Muslims are not part of them. We don't care about what outsiders think. We must protect our land and our people. Humanitarian concerns are only our second priority. And these are interviews that you conducted, and I want to commend you on getting those quotes from those individuals because it's very important to the story. So using that as a basis for this explanation of why is it, so again, we've been touching on it, but I want just very, specifically, how has this viewing of the Rohingya as foreigners influenced the perception and the really the lack of care against of the brutality against them? And then can you just briefly explain how you dispel, and you dispel that myth that they are foreigners in your book? Can you briefly explain how you dispel that myth and how that myth has contributed to this issue?
Yeah, there is this idea that many Rohingya, if not most, and it's a very prevalent idea in Burma, are illegal immigrants from what is now Bangladesh, before 1971, East Pakistan, right? Now, even according to the law, most Rohingya, even if they have arrived during colonial times, they are not illegal immigrants. According to Burmese law, whoever arrived before independence is entitled to Burmese citizenship, even according to the 1982 citizenship law that was used to strip the Rohingya of their citizenship. So according to that law, actually, there were 99.9% of the Rohingya would be citizens of Burma. So the problem is that there is certain fussiness and certain, there is a blur there between considering illegals those who arrived before and after independence. So many people in Burma think that actually if they arrived during colonial times, they are illegals, and they are not. There's also, of course, the fact that they were many ancestors of the Rohingya who were in Burma before colonial times, and they mixed with the ones who arrived in colonial times, and now it will be impossible to distinguish who is who, right? But the fact remains the same. Even according to Burmese laws, those who arrived before independence are not possibly regarded as illegal immigrants. Now, they claim that there have been massive influxes of illegal immigrants after independence from what is now Bangladesh. Now, I was wondering, is that true or not? So I took different censuses, the different censuses that I had available. The last census made by the British in 1931, actually there was they started to make another one in 41, but was interrupted by the war. And the census in 1983 and the 2014 census. And I compared the population growth of the Rakhine community and of the Buddhist community in Rakhine and the population growth in the Muslim community. And it was not so different, actually. There was not a big difference. And the difference that there might be could also be due to higher birth rates among the Muslim community, which is quite likely. So let's say that maybe, perhaps, the percentage of illegal population among the Rohingya is tops 5%, something like this. But they are regarded as, by default, as illegal immigrants because of this conceptual, this kind of conceptual slippage between those who arrived during colonial times and those who supposedly arrived later. So the way they are treated de facto by the Burmese state is as illegal immigrants by default who have to demonstrate that they are not illegal immigrants. In a way, they are treated as guilty unless proven innocent. And what happened with the 1982 citizenship law is that it gave nationality, it gave citizenship to all the people who were already citizens according to the previous citizenship law. So, but what the Burmese military did, and they didn't do immediately, they did it in the early 90s, was to take all of these documents, telling them, okay, we are going to change from the citizenship you had before to the citizen according to the new law. You give us all the documents. So they stripped them completely of the documents. So now they cannot demonstrate that they are entitled to citizenship because they don't have the documents. Because the very same guys who were supposed to give them citizenship are keeping the documents and assuming that they are not entitled to citizenship. So basically, like summing up is, yes, many Rohingya, perhaps even more than half of them, are descendants of people who arrived during colonial times. That's perfectly legal according to every existing law in Burma. And all of them should be entitled to full citizenship. But the famous influxes of illegal immigrants, that's a completely fake story. That's fake news. That's a completely false reading of history.
So now that we have a really good conception of the history and the complex political situation that goes into this, can you just sort of catch us up and talk about the specific atrocities being perpetuated against the Rohingya community in the last several years?
Yeah, well, everything started in 2000. Everything started a long time before. Everything started in 1978. That's you can say that's the turning point for the Rohingya, when Ne Win, the general in power at the time, launched an operation supposedly to detect illegal immigrants. They actually detected 1,000 or something like this. But it was conducted with such brutality, torching houses, killing, shooting at people, raping women, and so on, that up to 250,000 went to escape to Bangladesh as refugees in Cox's Bazar. And that started a kind of cycle of displacement and returning to Burma, but never as citizens, that had lasted up to the democratic transition, the so-called democratic transition initiated by the military in 2011. In 2012, there were really nasty waves of intercommunal violence between Buddhists and Muslims in Arakan, between the Rakhine and the Rohingya, that displaced a lot of Rohingya from their homes, a lot of Rakhine too, to internal displacement camps. Everything started with a story which was taken completely out of proportion, about 3 Muslim men who supposedly raped a Buddhist woman, and that was widely publicized in Rakhine State at the time. So that provoked a massacre of 10 Muslim guys in the southern of the state, and then retaliation by Muslims against Buddhists in the north, and a huge clash between both communities, in which the security forces took the side of the Rakhine. And there's evidence of some involvement from Rakhine politicians in stoking the flames and organizing mobs to attack Muslim quarters. So up to 120,000 probably more, probably 150, around 150,000 Rohingya were put in internal displacement camps, which in this context basically is a euphemism for concentration camps. And they continue. So as the political transition proceeded, the Rohingya became like the common enemy in Burma, like the scapegoats for everything. And most people in central Burma, probably they had never ever heard about the Rohingya before. And of course, they had never met, 99% of them, they had never met a Rohingya, because Rohingya, because of the policies imposed on them, had been confined to their own villages in northern Rakhine state. So, but there was a very virulent campaign of propaganda against the Rohingya during the transition. So in 2015, when Aung San Suu Kyi won the elections for the first time, Rohingya were not allowed to vote for the first time in history. So they lost their political voice as well. So what happened is that at that, and also around that time, a little bit before, the human smuggling networks that took them to other countries, particularly to Malaysia, were dismantled by the Thai and the Malaysian security forces. So there was that was another way out that it was close to them. So that explains the emergence of another group called Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, ARSA, that attacked the security forces for the first time in 2016. And they attacked, they organized coordinated attacks against 9 different police outposts in northern Arakan. And the reaction of the armed force was predictably brutal and basically indiscriminate and completely unproportional. They just went on a rampage against Rohingya, either combatants or civilians in the villages. And up to 80,000 fled to Bangladesh at the time. Now, that was only a preview, a kind of rehearsal of what happened next year when ARSA attacked again some security forces positions, and then the army went on a real rampage. Like they completely closed off the area. They sent the most brutal divisions in the army, the 99th, the 34th, the 77th. I'm not sure about 77. Oh, never mind. The 99th and the 33rd for sure. And basically, they tortured villages. They killed scores of civilians, including children. And nobody knows. But what they managed to do was to push out to Bangladesh around 700,000 people, which means 90% of the population of northern Rakhine, and maybe up to 60-70% of the total Rohingya population in Arakan. So at that time, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, General Min Aung Hlaing, the guy who staged the coup d'etat on 1st February, said, so words to the fact that the Rohingya, the Bengali issue, Bengali, a name that, the name that they use for the Rohingya, implying that they are from Bengal, had become an unfinished business that we had to finish now. So it sounds a lot like a final solution, isn't it? And basically, they managed to get rid of most of the Rohingya population, either mostly expelling them, but also killing perhaps up to 20,000 people. Now, for these operations, Burma stands accused of genocide at the International Court of Justice by the Gambia. And Aung San Suu Kyi went and defended the operation as a legitimate anti-terrorist operation, and in no way a genocide, and in no way an ethnic cleansing, and so on and so forth. So basically, she defended the military. And well, and this is a different story, but now the military have returned the favor, putting her under house arrest and dismantling her government. So yeah, that's the recent history of the Rohingya. There have been attempts, half-hearted attempts, to sign agreements with Bangladesh to repatriate the 700,000, actually 1 million Rohingya in Bangladesh because of previous refugee crisis. But it is evident that the Burmese don't want them back. And they basically set up a plan, they set up 2 processing centers in the border, and they would say that they would be able to process 300 people each day, which means that it will take maybe 2 years for all of the Rohingya to return to Burma. So basically, in the eyes of the Burmese military and the Burmese government, the unfinished problem of the Rohingya is being kind of resolved now, I guess.
Well, despite, from their perspective, resolving the Rohingya problem through these violent and exclusionary means, as you pointed out, there's still instability in the government. So, if we look from the contemporary perspective, the failure to really challenge the national races ideology and theory hasn't necessarily led to the stability and integrity of the nation state here in this context. So I'm wondering if you have any further comments you want to make about contemporary developments with the military coup and what is happening in Burma now, and how you connect it with the problems that you studied in this history. Do you see a continuity with those issues, or how else would you look at the situation of the Burmese nation in this context?
Well, it's very difficult to say what is going on now. For starters, I have to say that as many other people, I didn't expect a coup right now. I don't think many people expected it, except maybe people in government. Well, what happened after solving the unfinished business of the Rohingya is that immediately the Rakhine majority in Rakhine, but minority in the country, turned against the military, because they were united, the Rakhine and the Bamar government, as long as they had the common enemy there, as the Rohingya. But actually, the Rakhine resent Bamar domination from the central government as much as the Kachin or the Karen or any other ethnic minority. So about 1 year and a half later, the Arakan army, a Rakhine non-nationalist group, who had been operating in Kachin, returned to Rakhine and started a very vicious war with the Tatmadaw that lasted for 2 years. Now, and that connects with the coup. The coup happened, and it's seemingly unconnected with that, but I think there's some connection. The coup happened on 1st February, 3 months after the election that gave another victory to Aung San Suu Kyi. And the obvious reason was that the military was complaining about electoral fraud and so on. And basically, I think that the military were angry at Aung San Suu Kyi because and her party, because they stood up to them. Like, okay, we are playing to your tune for all the transition, and now you want to rob us the election results, the only thing that we can claim as ours. fuck you, we are not going to accept that. So the military was like, okay, you stood up for us, you stand up for us. To us, we are the guys with the guns. We take the power. But I think an element that also rankled in the military was developments in Rakhine State as well, which was the fact that shortly after the election, the Burmese army signed an informal ceasefire with the Arakan army in Rakhine State. And actually, the Aung San Suu Kyi's government canceled elections in many places in Rakhine because of security reasons, because of the war. And actually, the Arakan army kidnapped 3 NLD candidates. So shortly after the elections, the Tatmadaw, the Burmese army, signs a kind of ceasefire with the Arakan army, their biggest enemy in the last 2 years. And the Arakan army issues a statement saying, okay, we demand elections in the whole of Rakhine, including the places where they were cancelled by the NLD because of security reasons. And the Tatmadaw, the Burmese army, say, we support that. We support holding elections in the whole of Rakhine State. And the Arakan army then goes and releases the 3 NLD candidates they had kidnapped. And the NLD basically completely ignored the request of the Arakan army, and most crucially, the Burmese army. Now, I can imagine the generals getting really pissed off because of that. Really pissed off because they signed a peace agreement with their worst enemies, and the civilian government doesn't even listen to their demands. So I can imagine their thought process at some point going like, who does this woman think she is? We have to put her in her place. And I think beyond on top of the conflict around the election results and about the possible fraud in the elections, the situation in Rakhine was a huge factor, compounding tensions between them. Now, most ethnic armed groups in Burma have supported the civil disobedience movement and have condemned the military takeover. With one crucial exception, the Arakan army. The Arakan army, who has just signed a peace agreement with the military, haven't said anything. There was one news report from Reuters a week ago. They interviewed one Arakan army spokesman, and he made a very vague statement saying they condemn violence and they stand with the people and they are going to continue fighting for Rakhine people. And the ANP, the Arakan National Party, who was robbed of his victory because he couldn't go to the elections in the polls last November, they have accepted the military junta, and actually some members of the ANP are members of the junta in Rakhine. So Rakhine is the only state, the only region in Burma where there is no civil disobedience movement, except for a few protests in the south where Rakhine nationalism is not so strong. So the coup has elicited a lot of protests, a huge disobedience movement from the Bamar heartlands of the country. But most ethnic minorities and most ethnic armed groups have supported the civil disobedience movement, with the sole exception of Rakhine. Now, I don't know the reasons for the Arakan army to not to join the civil disobedience movement. And I think it could be tactical. They've been fighting for 2 years. They might be exhausted. They might be trying to regroup and reinforce their own forces to join the civil disobedience movement later on. I don't know, but as it stands now, Rakhine nationalism has aligned itself again with the Burma military junta. So as you can see, loyalties and partnerships and alliances are very fluid in Burma. It's very difficult to make any predictions of what might happen.
Breht, before you jump in with the final question of the interview, I just want to clarify a couple things that were brought up in that last answer for listeners that haven't read the book yet. And again, go out and get the book and it'll make all of these things very clear. But you mentioned the Arakan Army. That is the Buddhist nationalist militia group in the state that the Rohingya were from. But it was the Buddhist nationalist group from that same state, from the Buddhist ethnic group of the state that the Rohingya also were from. You mentioned the Arakan National Party, the ANP, that is the political party for the Buddhists in that state. The NLD. Yes, exactly. Not the Rohingya. The NLD, National League for Democracy, we brought this up earlier. That's Aung San Suu Kyi's party. And the last thing that was brought up in that answer that I just want to make sure everybody's clear on, when you mentioned the Tatmadaw, that is the military of Burma. So there you go, listeners. Everything in that answer should make total sense now. Breht, take us out to the end of this interview.
Sorry if I didn't explain certain things that I took for granted.
Sure.
All right. Well, earlier in the discussion, I can't remember if it was actually even pre-recording, you mentioned the fact that you might write this book a little differently given recent events. So I was hoping, as a wrap-up question, how would you have written this book differently given recent events, and why exactly?
Well, I think I overstated, and I think it was reasonable to do it at the time. The strength of the partnership between Aung San Suu Kyi and her party, the National League for Democracy, and the generals during the transition. I think I overstated how close they were, because at that time it seemed they were close, and I think that I overstated it because one of the reasons I overstated it, and I'm not trying to justify it myself, I was probably wrong on that. One of the reasons was that if the transition has shown something is that ideologically, the NLD, the Aung San Suu Kyi's party, and the generals are much more aligned than we could have thought before. So I think I probably made the mistake of understanding this ideological alliance as a power alliance. And it goes without saying that the coup is not about ideology. I don't think the coup is about power. It's not about Aung San Suu Kyi is taking the country in a direction that ideologically we don't agree with. No, because ideologically, Seychelles, basically there are four main issues in Burma, as I see it, in contemporary Burma. One is national identity, who is Burmese and who is not Burmese, and that is basically there is a consensus between the NLD and the military on the national races ideology, that is only national races are actually entitled to citizenship, which excludes the Rohingya. There's the issue of the other ethnic minorities who are indeed regarded as national races, but there is certain Bamar supremacism from the majority that they should be somehow subordinated to a centralized state. And Aung San Suu Kyi has demonstrated that she talks about a federal Burma, but actually everything she does is pretty centralized. And the other issue is economy, the economy. And both are neoliberal, basically. Both have you will never hear Aung San Suu Kyi talk about redistributive policies or social justice or anything like this. No. So ideologically, they are pretty much aligned. The only ideological difference, a strong ideological difference I can see between them is that Aung San Suu Kyi wants the military to be subordinated to the civilian government, and the military, once the civilian government subordinated to the military. But once they have power, whoever it is, they are going to do basically more or less the same. It's not that, they are going to take the country in a different direction. So the coup is about power. It's a power struggle between Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD on one hand, and the Tatmadaw and the Burmese army on the other hand, led by Min Aung Hlaing. Now, everything seemed to go very well when I was writing the book in this partnership between them, right? Aung San Suu Kyi wanted to change the constitution. It was the only thing she was protesting about, precisely to put the military under the control of the civilian government. But the constitution is kind of shielded by a series of conditions that make it very, very difficult to amend, but she was not going to manage to do it. So anyway, she can say whatever she wants. The constitution is virtually unchangeable. So in a sense, the coup is completely uncalled for, even for the Tatmadaws, the Burmese army, own interest. The system was working pretty well for them, and Aung San Suu Kyi was, not a real threat to them in any possible sense. So we don't really know why the coup has happened. Nobody knows, because nobody really knows what's going on in the higher echelons of the military. But of course, after the coup, I wouldn't have stressed so much this partnership between Aung San Suu Kyi and the military that I may have overstressed. Seeing it from now, I might have overstressed a little bit in the book. So probably when there is a second edition, there will be some kind of new chapter explaining all this and updating the book. Basically.
Well, that's a very good note to end on. I'm looking forward to when there is a second edition of the book, because I really enjoyed the book. It taught me a lot. I talked in the introduction about how little I knew about Burma before reading your book. So thank you for writing it. It was very important. And understanding the history is certainly important for understanding the current events and for seeing what the future might hold. So again, our guest today was Carlos Sardiña Galache, who is the author of The Burmese Labyrinth, A History of the Rohingya Tragedy, out from Verso Books. Be sure to pick it up. Carlos, thanks for coming on. How can our listeners find you and the work that you're doing?
I'm on Twitter, CHGALACHE, and they can, whatever I write or whatever I do, I always post it in Twitter. I used to work for EFE News Agency, the Spanish national agency, but I quit my job 2 months ago. So now I'm going back to writing in English, which is something I haven't done for the last 2 years while I was working for the Spanish news agency. So I expect to write a little bit more in English now that I'm a free man again.
Well, we're certainly looking forward to reading that, the new information that you're writing in English. And listeners, just as an aside, as I mentioned at the beginning of the interview, I interviewed Carlos twice on the David Feldman Show to talk about the recent events in Myanmar post-coup. If you want to find those are episodes 1215 and episode 1220. You can find the time codes and whatnot in those episodes. So be sure to check those out if you want to hear my conversations with Carlos about the recent events and really diving more into that. So Carlos, thanks for coming onto the show. And
thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I look forward to talking with you again. We'll try to bring you back on Feldo's show again soon to talk about the recent events.
Anytime.
Great. Take care. And listeners, we'll be right back with the wrap up. Well, listeners, we're back. Adnan, Breht, that was a great conversation that we just had with Carlos. I've had the pleasure of interviewing him a few times before, and every time I interview him, I always find his analysis so incisive, really cutting to the core of Burmese history and Burmese society contemporarily. And I find these conversations with him very enriching, and I'm sure that you both did as well. Breht, I'm going to turn to you first on kind of what the key takeaways from the conversation were for you that we just had with Carlos.
The key takeaways broadly is something that I really love about this show and what we focus on, which is the history and then the legacy of colonialism. I think that's incredibly important. And this is another sort of episode in which we do the deep dive and really parse out how that history is inseparable from the present. I also enjoyed the tying together, or like this almost Fanonian point made about how race and ethnicity dictates and shapes class in Burmese society, which, Fanon says in the colonial context, this is often the case, and that, plays out and is very true in this situation as well. And then also, to note at the end there that, Carlos has close friends that are at this moment hiding from the coup government and trying to stay safe. Many of them, as he mentioned, were journalists. So this is an ongoing situation happening right now. It's a crisis. It's a playing out of multiple atrocities. And it's sort of taken an odd turn. Even him, with all of his deep understanding of the situation, it just gestures at the complexity, didn't necessarily see this coming. And it's still sort of hard to understand given the context of everything he knows. So I think, again, that speaks to the complexity and the nuance of the situation. So overall, I just found it incredibly fascinating, specifically about, as we all mentioned in the intro, a country and a history that we all didn't know too much about. So I learned a lot, absolutely.
Adnan, what were your key takeaways from this conversation? And then perhaps after that, we'll have a little bit of a conversation back and forth about maybe future things for us to look into regarding this topic and what we're going to be looking for in the current events.
Well, firstly, I just wanted to say I thought the interview was tremendous. He has such a command of this history. As a journalist, I was really impressed, the kind of analysis, not just of the current political situation where he's gone and done reporting and spoken to people, but how he was able to integrate that rather effortlessly with very sophisticated analysis about the historical conditions and changes that have led up to this period. I mean, the book is really wonderful. I still want to emphasize, you've listened to this. This should whet your appetite to really go to the book and dive in, because in addition to narrating the history in greater detail, he also really used a lot of very interesting social scientific anthropology and sophisticated ways to interpret the changing nature of ethnicity and theories of nationalism, particularly in the third world, how they're imagined communities. But he differs with Benedict Anderson's view, and he pointed that out in the interview as well, that this isn't a real imagined nation. They don't really seem to imagine it as a nation in that kind of commonly shared sense of identity that can be constructed. And that's his conclusion. And we see that that's perhaps part of the reason why, despite the scapegoating of the Rohingya as this group that could be anathematized as not fitting into, the national identity of this nation because of their religious and ethnic differences and being characterized and demonized as invaders from outside or illegal immigrants who are a threat to the society, that despite the brutal and bloody, so-called solution of that problem, they've been essentially eliminated now, that nonetheless you have a very unstable society because they haven't confronted the real problems of nationalism. And I think that's another interesting question. Sometimes national liberation, like Fanon in the 60s was writing about the importance of national liberation and a kind of idea of a national culture to free yourself from colonialism. But the post-colonial condition, we can see the ways in which nationalism as an idea or an ideology can lead to some terrible asymmetries of power and problems that can even lead to ethnic cleansing and so on. So I was very, after that conversation, just reminded of the dangers of extreme nationalist ideas, and especially if they're yoked to not only a sense of ethnicity, but also religious difference. You have a recipe here for various I guess, harnessing of sort of certain kinds of energies that can be very, very destructive and dangerous in the way that they want to exclude people. So, that was, I think my takeaways are just reminders of those forces. And that, if we're going to have true equity, justice, and community, we have to have a humanism that goes beyond narrow ethnic differences and doesn't participate in the kind of zero-sum game, that seems to be imagined in this idea of national races that are legitimate and those that are not, in a way of configuring, political community. Those political communities have to be more expansive and ground on a more universal basis of human dignity and rights and justice.
I'm just going to pitch out something from the book very briefly. And then I'm going to bring up another point that I'd be curious as to both of your perspectives on. So firstly, it's very important to note that while there is a lot of analysis going on, both in this interview and in the book, Carlos, as Adnan and I just said, is very incisive with his analysis. He cuts very deep, both in historical analysis as well as contemporary analysis, but yet this is still a very human story. And in the book, that's really brought out multiple times about the sheer depravity, and I'm going to keep using that word, of the situation. And I mentioned earlier that he included stories from a refugee camp and he also included stories from firsthand accounts of these massacres carried out of the Rohingya. And they're so instructive to get those firsthand accounts as to what the situation is really like. And it really does give you a glimpse in that you can't fully comprehend until you get those personal accounts. And I think it's so important. And I'm going to, just before this episode drops, I'm going to go on our Patreon and do a reading of both the firsthand account from the refugee camp as well as the firsthand account of the massacre. So if you're hearing this now, I'll have just uploaded that on Patreon. So if you're on our Patreon, be sure to listen to that. If you're not on our Patreon, it's a great time to join. But those accounts really are important for drawing out the sheer depravity of the situation. Numbers alone can't do that. It's these personal accounts that do that. Now, the second thing I want to bring up, and I'm curious as to both of your takes on this, as Adnan said, it's very important to understand that this isn't a single ethnic nation. It's a very multi-ethnic nation. And there's been conflicts between many of these ethnic groups. And this is something that Carlos brought up in the interview, but it's even more extensively laid out in the book. There's been dozens of insurgent ethnic groups throughout the country's history, especially post-colonization, where they were basically all shoved into one country. And up until the present, there's still ethnic conflicts occurring in the country. Just there are armed conflicts on both sides, whereas the Rohingya, other than one or two small times where there were militant Rohingya groups that were rising up, at most points in history, they were basically turkey shoots where the government would go in and massacre Rohingya individuals. And the question is how do you combat that? It's easy to say that, well, there was a lot of Rohingya. If they all would have taken up arms, they could have fought back. But that's ignoring the entire weight of the situation. That's ignoring the fact that all of these Buddhist groups in Burma, Myanmar, were firmly pitted against the Rohingya people. Both the military government, when they were in charge, and again now are in charge, as well as the civilian government when the NLD was in charge under Aung San Suu Kyi. Regardless of who is in charge, those two different groups, both the pro-democracy civilian government, as well as the military and the military government, they were always united in their hatred of the Rohingya. They were always united in their loathing and their will to get rid of the Rohingya. And it reminds me of I mean, of course, to a much more brutal extent, at least, in contemporary days, to what Walter Rodney wrote in The Groundings with My Brothers, and in the necessity for Black power in a multi-ethnic society. And he writes that Black power is not incompatible with a multiracial society where the individual counts equally, because the moment that power is equitably distributed among several ethnic groups, the very relevance of making the distinction between groups will be lost. And the question is how do we transcend those ethnic and religious divisions between these groups? And at this point, it seems like it's going to be completely lost, because the Rohingya have been almost entirely exterminated from Myanmar's society writ large. So I don't know if either of you folks want to respond to that, give your thoughts on that, but it's something that I'm kicking in my head. When we face atrocities like this, how do we analyze that, and how do we transcend that?
I feel that's a rhetorical question, because
I was going to say, it's
how we can answer that. I mean, hopefully through studying a lot of cases where we look at this and understand historically the roots of these sorts of animosities, and also recognizing and realizing that certain choices and decisions in those histories have sharpened and created these conditions. It was very instructive to read the second section of this book that goes all the way back to the pre-colonial period, starting in the 9th century, and traces a little bit what a kind of plural sort of world this was, and how, of course, there's kingdoms forming and fighting with one's neighbors, but these weren't the sort of vicious eliminationist genocidal sorts of hatreds. They were cases where a particular ethno-religious dynastic grouping may rule over others, but it's a multi-religious and multi-ethnic kind of community or polity, and that politics wasn't organized around conflict because of ethnic or religious difference. And we may think of these as, these must be age-old hatreds, but in point of fact, something transforms in the colonial period and into the modern period that politicizes these identities and their differences in new ways. And that, it seems to me, is the real tragic circumstances, that we're dealing with the legacies of that in modernity. So we really need to think about what is the nature of nationalism, what is the nature of the nation state, and how it tries to organize under, unless you have a free and equal society that is able to grant everybody full human dignity and equality, it seems that you end up having the use of various ways of organizing your claims upon the state or within the state vis-a-vis other groups. And that's just a destructive, zero-sum way in which modern politics seem to have been organized under the nation state, under neo-imperialism, under the post-colonial world of late capitalism. So it's really insoluble to think, well, how could one solve this sort of situation? When we look at them as episodic kinds of incidents or cases. But if we look at it more globally, I think, we can understand that this is the problem of, asserting political identities in ethnic and religious terms, rather than, trying to find ways where we can improve and bolster looking at them in human terms, and understanding those economic forces and political forces that oppress and divide us.
There is no, that is the question, right? And there is a nice, concise answer, but I think Adnan gets at some of the really important core issues that these problems revolve around, one of which is the separation of all humanity into nation states, right? As a sort of the stage of historical development that we're currently in, and as part and parcel, perhaps even with the capitalist mode of production, nation states are something like the form that political structures take under a global capitalist regime. And so, you might have to as many states have, start with the nation state. But there's something problematic about the nation state inherently. That doesn't solve all of the problem, but I think it is part of the puzzle of why these things happen. I mean, you can talk about ethnic conflict. I mean, Israel, Palestine, the U.S. and countless groups around the world. These are ongoing, seemingly intractable problems. And I think part of it is just the overall social, political, and economic global systems that we're living in, and trying to transcend them, I think is gesturing towards something like a solution to some of these more specific problems, but impossible to say.
Yeah, and I do want to state that I knew it was an impossible question that I was giving you. I'm really just, here for the dialogue back and forth, try to kick some ideas around. Hopefully it spurs some thoughts in the listeners. But yeah, I was well aware that there was no good answer to that question. But I do think that the things that you said were beneficial to keep in mind when thinking about how to resolve this issue. And I also think that it's important to keep in mind what we discussed briefly with Carlos, but what's even more fully fleshed out in his book, that in a lot of these cases, it's bad historical analysis or false historical analysis that contributes to these conflicts. So, of course, one of the things that drives, and again, this was in the interview, but it's worth putting our finger back on once again, one of the things that drives the conflict between Burmese society writ large and the Rohingya people as an ethnic group is this false history that they're foreign invaders coming from Bangladesh, relatively recently to try to reap the spoils of Myanmar, because, Myanmar has such a rich society that everybody would benefit from if it wasn't for these darn Rohingya out in the western provinces. But as Carlos shows, it's false. It's a false history, but yet that is the history that the people in Myanmar use as justification for a lot of these completely abhorrent measures that they're using against them. And so I think that keeping in mind that a true understanding of history, as well as these things that you both have been bringing up, are going to play at how we can address this issue. But of course, there is no true resolution to it that we can come up with just between the three of us. This is something that as a society we need to undertake. So any last thoughts from either of you guys? I guess I'll turn to each of you for any last thoughts perhaps on recent events or whatever you want to say. Adnan, we'll start with you. Breht, we'll finish with you before we wrap up this conversation.
Great. Yeah. Just as a last coda, I think this is an interesting component in a history of seeing also how anti-Muslim discourse can circulate globally and have both local resonances, meanings, but also attach itself to the kind of global war on terrorism and these kinds of, reality of the post 9/11 world that make it possible for states to suppress a local Muslim group because they can attach it to a wider legitimizing struggle against terrorism. And so this is one case we see that. We also have seen, of course, in other parts of South Asia where this will be the case, in India, for example, with Hindu nationalism. And it did remind me a lot, these issues about citizenship laws and constitutional manipulations that disadvantage these vulnerable peoples. It reminded me quite a lot about recent events that have taken place in Kashmir with, establishing a new regime that is going to incorporate it as a state more fully basically violate certain provisions of the original constitution that created India and Pakistan after the British colonial period. So we do have continuing problems, I think, with the legacies of British colonialism globally, but this also is an interesting story to fit into the larger component of the world after the collapse of the British Empire and hotspots and problems that, Israel, Palestine, Ireland, parts of Africa, and of course the Indian subcontinent. So it's interesting that we're studying this is one episode or location within, I think, a larger, broader global story that I hope we'll do more with in future episodes. So those were just the kind of last thoughts about going forward. There's some big narratives that this specific history can fit into, and I'd be interested in looking at other places and histories that also contribute to that larger analysis or those larger narratives.
Yeah, the last thing I would say is just pointing to something that was sort of covered in passing in the interview, which is the idea that because of the deep traditionalist strains of Theravada Buddhism, that karma itself is used as a naturalizer of the political system. That if you're born rich and powerful, it's because of previous lives and the karma that you've accrued has allowed for you to do that. And if you're poor or, you're a member of a vulnerable or marginalized group, that's also your karma. And I just think it's important to note that idea does exist within Buddhism, but it's also contended within Buddhism. There are much more nuanced takes on karma itself, and there's also a really interesting conflict between the Buddhist conception of anatta, no self, which is basically say that nothing in the universe has a substantial self core that separates it from everything else in the cosmos, and how that can relate possibly to the idea of karma between lives. There's a little bit of tension there. If there's no soul, there's no self, much less a soul. How does it get translated from one lifetime to another? So I think I might actually want to do some philosophy of Buddhism work on Rev Left, working through those nuances, because I think it's really interesting. But once again, as in so many religions, you see religious ideology being used to naturalize a system. And I thought that was at least worth pointing out.
And it pushes me towards a final thought here that we'll end on. And hopefully this will encourage listeners to buy the book if we haven't already convinced them of the necessity to read the Burmese Labyrinth for understanding all that's been going on in Myanmar. But you mentioned karma, Breht, and it brings up something very specific that Carlos brought up in the book that was quite shocking. And you mentioned how religion can be used to advance what a governing body wants to push anyway. And Carlos in the book at one point brings up how the military dictatorship instituted forced labor in the country. And their justification for that was that by having people do this forced labor, building infrastructure and whatnot, they were allowing those people to improve their karma. And that was the justification for enacting forced labor all throughout the country, was to improve the karma of the citizens in the country, which of course it serves two ends. One is to provide justification for doing it. And two, it provides it provides a barrier between the people being able to rise up together and say, no, this is absolutely insane, because what are you going to say? Now you're having to fight against religion as well as a military dictatorship in order to fight this inhumane forced labor that was enacted across the country. So this book is full of interesting tidbits like that you're not going to find anywhere else if it's not for reading it in here. So on that note, I'm going to wrap this up. I want to say thanks to both of you. And of course, thanks to Carlos as well. I thought this was a tremendous episode. And I do want to encourage you to pick up the book, because it's very profound and it was very incisive. So do pick up the Burmese Labyrinth. But Adnan, why don't I turn to you now and have you tell the listeners how they can follow you on social media? Well,
listeners can catch up with me on Twitter at Adnan A. Husain, Husain. And I'd invite listeners to check out my other podcast called The Majlis, Majlis. You can find it anywhere on the usual platforms. And especially if you're interested in the Middle East and Islamic world, you might find some of that content quite interesting as well.
And Adnan, just briefly, what were some of the recent episodes that you've had of the Majlis? Of course, keeping in mind that we're releasing this about a month after we're recording it. But what are some of the things that the listeners can find if they go there?
Well, we just recorded an episode with Michael Ferguson, who studies Ottoman history, and his particular interest is on the African descendants, African community in Ottoman Izmir in the late 19th and early 20th century. Absolutely fascinating history that very few people have heard about. So that's one episode. We also had a panel on the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism, its working definition. And I brought together a few people who are specialists and scholars of the Middle East who are concerned about the way in which it may limit the possibility to actually do research and teaching on the Middle East that's historically accurate and responsible in describing the nature of the region if they cannot actually describe, Israel's policies and activities in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip, for example. So that's an episode where we talked a little bit about those kinds of issues affecting the study of history. So those are some of the episodes we've had recently, and we'll be having one coming up that I think people should check out, which is about another podcast about the tragic story of Suleiman Fakiri, who died in custody in Ontario, was brutally beaten to death. And his family has been conducting a campaign to seek accountability and justice for Soli. And so we'll be talking a little bit about that tragic and disturbing story in the context of a new podcast about his life and the fate of the struggle to seek accountability for his treatment.
And I want to commend you for the work that you've been doing covering that IHRA definition of anti-Semitism on the show. You've had a couple of episodes on that now, and they're very important. And I'm really looking forward to those recorded episodes coming out. And listeners, I hope that you'll be checking those out too. We lost Breht at the very last minute here, so I'll just tell you his information. If you want to follow Breht, you can find him on Twitter at RevLeftRadio, and you can find all three of the shows that Breht does, as well as all of the Patreon information and whatnot, at revolutionaryleftradio.com. As for me, you can find me on Twitter at Huck1995. You can find me on Patreon covering public health and science at patreon.com/Huck1995. And you can find our show, Guerrilla History, on Twitter at Guerrilla_pod, GUERRILLA_pod. And support us on Patreon at patreon.com/Guerrilla History. Again, GUERRILLA History. And hopefully, if you're on our Patreon, you'll find that reading that I did from the Burmese Labyrinth just before this episode comes out interesting and enriching to the discussion. So until next time, listeners, thanks for listening. Hope that you learned a lot. Solidarity.